You thought people got louder, that life became more complicated, that something outside you had shifted without warning. But what if none of that actually changed? What if the noise was always there, and you were simply hearing it differently now? There is a quiet shift most people miss, a moment where awareness sharpens but reality stays exactly the same. You start noticing the tone in voices you once ignored, the distance in conversations you used to feel safe in, the weight of thoughts you once brushed aside. It feels like the world has changed, but in truth, it is your perception that has moved. This is not collapse, it is clarity. And clarity can feel unsettling because it removes the comfort of not seeing. You begin to wonder what changed in you, when the real answer is that nothing outside you transformed at all. You just started seeing what was always there. And in that realization something subtle but powerful happens. You stop chasing change and start understanding perception was the only thing moving all along, leaving you with a clearer sense of what was always true. Nothing changed, you just finally began to notice everything around you always. You don't notice the moment awareness turns on. It isn't loud or dramatic, it arrives as a subtle recalibration of how you take in life. One day you hear a shift in someone's tone that you would have ignored before. Another day you catch a pause in conversation that feels heavier than it should. You begin sensing tension in rooms that once felt neutral, and patterns in people that no one explains out loud. It feels like the world is changing, but what's actually changing is the way your mind filters it. The brain doesn't upgrade reality, it removes the filters that once softened it. And as those filters drop, perception begins to move faster than reality can keep up with. That gap creates emotional dissonance. You feel like something is different, but you can't point to what. This is the quiet threshold of awareness, where noticing becomes unavoidable. And with it comes a strange weight, as awareness strips away the comfortable illusions you learned on, leaving you without the soft explanations you used to rely on to make people and situations feel simpler and safer than they truly are in reality. The discomfort of seeing too much too clearly. You used to believe the world was getting worse, that something outside you had shifted into chaos. But what if it was never the world becoming heavier, only your perception becoming sharper? You always saw fragments, but now you see systems connecting beneath them. You always sensed problems in people and places, but now you can name them clearly. Relationships feel more transactional, social dynamics more visible, and even silence carries weight. It feels like something has changed outside you, but it is only your awareness expanding. The noise was never added to the world, you simply stopped ignoring what was already there. This is the paradox of clarity, where seeing more does not make life easier, only more real. And in that realization, you start to understand that discomfort is not confusion, but exposure. You cannot return to the softer version of reality you once lived inside. Because once perception expands, it does not shrink back into ignorance without cost. And what once felt like the world becoming more chaotic is revealed instead as your mind finally refusing to filter truth, leaving you with a sharper, heavier awareness that clarity is not comfort and that cannot be reversed ever. You begin to notice something subtle but persistent. You are not reacting differently, you are simply noticing more than others seem to. In conversations, you catch emotional undercurrents people glide past without question. In groups, you see tension forming long before anyone acknowledges it. Patterns in behavior become obvious to you, yet remain invisible to those around you. And strangely, it doesn't make you feel superior. It makes you feel isolated in a way you can't easily explain. Because awareness doesn't arrive as confidence, it arrives as weight. When you try to express what you see, the response is often confusion or dismissal. So you start choosing silence over explanation. Not because you are unsure, but because clarity doesn't translate easily into shared experience. This creates an internal conflict you can't fully resolve: speak the truth and risk disconnection, or stay quiet and maintain fragile connection. Neither option feels complete. And in that space, you start to realize something uncomfortable. You are not becoming different from others in intelligence or emotion, you are simply no longer filtering reality in the same way. That difference creates distance even in crowded rooms, even in familiar spaces. And slowly, the realization settles in that awareness itself can separate you from people without ever moving you physically away from them. You start to notice that nothing feels neutral anymore. Every moment seems to carry a second layer of meaning, as if life has quietly turned into something you must constantly interpret. Silence is no longer empty, it becomes information. A pause in conversation feels like a signal. A delayed reply turns into a question you start answering in your own head before anyone speaks. You begin reading tone where there is only text, reading intention where there is only behavior. Over time, this becomes automatic, almost addictive, as your mind searches for patterns even when none are intended. It feels like awareness, but it slowly turns into cognitive fatigue. You are no longer living experiences directly, you are translating them in real time. Every interaction becomes a process of decoding, Every emotional shift something you try to predict before it fully forms. And the more you do it, the harder it becomes to switch it off. The weight does not come from doing more in life, but from noticing more in it, until even rest carries interpretation. And that is where exhaustion begins, quietly, not as collapse, but as endless awareness that never stops processing anything at all anymore now. Once you see patterns, you cannot unsee them. There is no return to the way things felt when they were softer, less defined, easier to ignore. You can try to pretend, to step back into simplicity, but perception does not forget what it has learned. It begins to feel like loss, but it is actually the permanence of awareness settling in quietly. This is not punishment, and not distortion, but the evolution of how you perceive everything around you. Peace does not come from seeing less, but from resisting less what you already see. You realize there is no point in trying to return to a previous version of perception, because awareness does not move backward once it has expanded. Even when you attempt to ignore what you see, the mind continues to register it in the background, quietly reinforcing what you already know. And that is where acceptance slowly replaces resistance, not as surrender, but as understanding that perception itself has changed permanently. You stop fighting the clarity and start recognizing that peace was never about seeing less, but about not resisting what is already seen. Acceptance becomes the only path you didn't change. You just stopped going blind on purpose. Awareness is not the problem. The discomfort you felt was never a sign that something went wrong in you, but that unconscious living was never built to last. It only works as long as you don't look too closely. Once you do, everything changes shape, not because reality shifts, but because your relationship with it becomes honest. And honesty often feels heavier before it feels freeing. Seeing clearly doesn't isolate you as much as it refines what you choose to connect with. Not every thought deserves your energy, not every pattern needs your full attention. You begin to realize that awareness is not a constant burden you must carry, but a lens you can learn to direct. You are not required to hold everything you notice. And in that space, something quiet opens up: choice. You decide what matters enough to stay with, and what can simply be observed without attachment. This is where awareness turns from overload into strength, not because the world becomes simpler, but because your engagement becomes intentional. So now the question is not what you see, but what you will allow yourself to keep engaging with. What's one thing you started noticing about life that you can't ignore anymore?